May 1982. After 6 weeks at sea, the British task force, a fleet of 150 ships, arrived off the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. Their mission, to liberate the islands from Argentina, who'd invaded 6 weeks before. The British chose San Carlos Bay to establish a beachhead onto the islands, but there were problems. 60 Argentine troops were stationed on Fanning Head, a rocky outcrop overlooking the entrance to San Carlos Water. The Navy's first job was to neutralize this threat. Brigadier Julian Thompson, commanding the amphibious operations, watched from HMS Fearless.
I went up onto the bridge and looked where I could see Fanning Head, where there were some Argentines being bombarded by one of the ships. And I could see the shells bursting.
The Argentine soldiers scattered under the bombardment. The way was now clear for the landings. Packed into assault ships and the luxury cruise liner Canberra, 3,000 paratroopers and Royal Marines prepared to go in. San Carlos is 65 miles from the island's capital, Stanley, where 10,000 Argentine troops were stationed. This ruled out a counterattack. The British plan was to set up a beachhead and to helicopter its troops into action. In the landing craft, the Paras and Marines, average age 18, were ready for combat.
It was very, very scary. You know, there was people being sick. I must add, not being seasick. They were being scared sick. You know, I thought it was a bit more scary than parachuting, actually. We were told to expect an opposed landing. So, of course, we all had imaginations of things rushing through your mind, the ramp going down on the front of the landing craft and being met by a hail of bullets, and people praying to themselves. Some people were making light of the matter and cracking jokes, but you could hear quite a few false laughs.
Special Boat Service commandos already ashore were to signal the all clear to Marine Major Ewan Southby Taylor.
The signals on the beach I've got scribbled on the top of the chart that I used on that day. Very simple. Alpha in a little red pimple light would mean all clear. Bravo, the enemy about, so be prepared. And if they flashed Charlie, it meant there was enemy on the beach. There were no signals at all. And I thought, right, are the enemy there? And the SBS haven't been able to get in, or the SBS have been captured or killed. Or is just nobody there? What do I do? And I'm afraid it didn't take half a second to decide that we went on in regardless.
The Paras' motto of ready for anything was tested when they hit the beach.
The ship grounded, the ramp dropped, somebody shouted out troops, which was not a command that we'd heard before. In all our training, even on the ship, it was an omission that nobody actually said what the order was to get off.
When Paras go into battle, there's a green light on the aircraft and the order is given go, and that's when you start to jump out of the aircraft. I think there's a different word of command to get out of a landing craft.
And eventually somebody, I think probably one of the sergeant majors from one of the rifle companies, shouted go. We all knew what that meant. And off we went.
The landing was unopposed. Marines began rounding up the Argentine stragglers from Fanning Head. Major Carlos Esteban, in charge of the Argentine garrison, had escaped the bombardment. He radioed his headquarters in Stanley with news of the British invasion.
There was a big white vessel entering the strait from the north. landing craft approaching the shore, and helicopters practically flying over us. I knew we couldn't counterattack, so the only thing that could get me out of there alive was a quick and violent response from the Air Force.
We knew that we had secured the beachhead and that we could expect at any moment air attacks from the Argentinians. We began immediately to dig our trenches.
Helicopters and landing craft continued to pour in men and materials to consolidate the beachhead before air attacks came, as liberated islanders watched.
I think most of us dug our trenches with complete enthusiasm to make sure we were safe from air attack. Fantastic fun for the children. They were in and out our trenches, very keen to learn about our weapons.
The Argentine commander, General Menendez, had expected the British to land near Stanley. At first he believed the invasion at San Carlos was a trick.
Initially, there were doubts as to whether the operation was the main landing or not. At about 8:30 a.m. local time, we sent a message, then another one at about 10:30 a.m. Then finally, the main land command took the decision to attack with the Air Force.
Heavily armed Mirage and Skyhawk jets took off from bases on the Argentine mainland. Their flying time to San Carlos was just over 50 minutes. If they could push the British back into the sea, the war could be won for Argentina. Hours after the first landings at San Carlos, 1,000 troops were ashore. Aboard the Canberra, thousands more were anxious to join them. But the Argentinians had launched a counterattack. Their jet fighters, flying at 100 feet to avoid British radar, were minutes away. Unaware, life was almost too normal for the British landing party. Brigadier Gustavo Puma was piloting a 600-mile-an-hour Mirage jet.
The main objective were the landing craft. We always tried to attack them, but we met with a defensive arc of frigates, and it was difficult to cross them. So many pilots, because of the anxiety of combat, shot at the first vessel they saw.
Men aboard the troop-carrying ships in San Carlos felt they were sitting ducks.
We were in the back end of the Canberra. The captain, I could hear him, and it was like a cricket commentary. He was saying, here they are, they're coming in, air raid warning red, yes, there's 3 of them, and they're just coming right towards us, and we're listening to this, which is rather unnerving.
I've never been, excuse my French, shit scared as when they sealed that hold when we got an air raid come over, and you were sealed off to the bottom of the ship. And if you got hit there, you were going to go down with it.
Going ashore was in many ways the scariest part because we were absolutely jam-packed like sardines into a landing craft. Although it was a short journey across the water to the beach, to the landing area, we were very exposed. One rocket would have just killed everyone, I think, aboard that landing craft, so that was really very tense time.
Wing Commander Geraldo Isaac was flying an A4 Skyhawk jet.
During the attacks I didn't feel bad. I felt fine. I had no fear. There is very little time in this kind of attack, probably between 20 to 30 seconds, from lowering the plane's nose to scanning the situation, looking for a target, aiming, firing and escaping.
The Argentine pilots only had a few seconds to pick a target. The large British destroyers were the easiest and most visible. Antrim was hit at lunchtime on the first day. But the bombs went straight through her without exploding. Royal Engineer bomb disposal expert John Phillips was dispatched to defuse them.
The Argentine bombs were not exploding because the pilots were too brave. They were coming in too low. They weren't giving it sufficient flying time for the bomb to arm in the air, which is what it's supposed to do, before they hit the target.
Wave after wave of Argentine planes attacked the British warships. HMS Ardent was attacked 15 times.
It was the 16th air raid of the day that hit the ship, with bombs which had exploded in the hangar, taking with it the aircraft and its crew.
Seen through the missile sights of another Royal Navy ship, it was clear Ardent could not survive much longer. The 17th air raid of the day proved decisive.
I felt the explosion. There was a big thump, whoomph, and I don't remember much else after that. I came to and I couldn't get up. My hand had been damaged. I could see a finger hanging off in my glove. I was bleeding in other places too. And I thought, oh dear, this is it, you know, this is, time's up for me. Luckily, there was somebody moving around the area, and he came up to me and said, "Are you all right?" I pulled a piece of formica out of my head across here. We couldn't see anything because of the thick, black, acrid smoke that was filling the whole compartment. We'd actually sort of sat down and I suppose we were cuddling each other, really. The old cliche, "I'm too young to die," goes through your head that time. That's very true.
Surgeon Commander Rick Jolly was flying supplies to a field hospital he'd set up in a disused factory when Ardent took the fatal hit.
We saw a strike on one of the Royal Navy ships, and we discovered it was Ardent. It was a very dramatic moment, because I never thought I'd see a Royal Navy ship on fire, being abandoned.
The ship slewed round, or the wind changed direction, and had this wonderful taste of sweet-smelling air, and we had a glimpse of light. We had to crawl out onto the side of the ship, which we did, and we then put our life jackets on and jumped in the water.
From Rick Jolly's helicopter, the pilot saw 2 men in the freezing water, but the chopper had no winchman.
As we hovered and the helicopter was moving over someone that the pilot had spotted in the water, I lowered the strop to this bloke, and he was so weak he couldn't get into it. I had to go down and get him. My strength lasted long enough to get him up into the helicopter, and I was so pleased that I'd done something useful in my life. I gave a thumbs up to the crewman, who gave me a thumbs up and pointed down, and I had to go down a second time. It was for a chief petty officer. He could see the aircraft above him, and he thought he was dying. He thought, hey, what happens next? And with the blood pouring down his face from a huge wound in his head and the fingers missing from his left hand, he looked up and saw the Archangel Gabriel.
Noticed that right in front of me were his badge of rank, Commander Doctor.
He saw my badge of rank on the front of my chest and thought, well, I really am going to die now.
All commanders were old, and I thought, this is just surreal, it's bizarre. Doctors do not come down on a piece of wire picking people out of the water.
Enticknap was flown home. It was the end of his war. Ardent sank the following day, having suffered 22 dead and 25 wounded. the highest casualties on any ship in the battle for San Carlos. But the Argentinians were also paying a high price.
I saw lots of explosive tracer and fire bursting from the ships. At the exit, we communicated to see if we all got out. Number 2, Lieutenant Lucero, didn't reply. Later, we knew he was shot down by naval anti-aircraft batteries and ejected over the fleet. He was rescued and taken to a landing ship. And there's a famous image where the M of morphine is marked on his forehead.
He has got a complete fore and aft dislocation of his left knee. I suspect you see that he did that ejecting through the hatchway of the canopy of the aircraft. He'll be very lucky if he's flying jet aircraft again.
Some Argentine pilots were less fortunate. In the afternoon, HMS Argonaut was struck. The ship's ammunition was set off, killing 2 ratings. One of them was just 18 that day. By day's end, the Argentine pilots had failed to hit any of the vital landing craft. And the British had more than 3,000 men safely ashore at San Carlos. Even so, 3 Royal Naval ships were out of action, and 2 more had unexploded bombs below decks.
In conventional war, people get killed. Aircraft get shot down, ships get sunk. It's called attrition. And attrition is a necessary and daily part of the deal. Your job is to try and ensure that the enemy suffers a good deal more attrition than you do. So there's a balance to be struck, like, in this case, lose ships to put his aircraft and his air force out of effective action. We expected to lose ships. The only question was, which ones and how many?
By nightfall, Argentina had lost 13 planes and 5 of her best pilots were killed. But the conflict was far from over. With all the men ashore, the next day British landing ships were ferrying ammunition and heavy equipment to the beachhead. After HMS Ardent sank, Antelope, her sister ship, was ordered to take her place.
We were told to replace Ardent, putting ourselves in between any direct attack on the beachhead.
Antelope came under almost immediate air attack and took a direct hit, but the bomb failed to explode. Radar operator Geoffrey Fox Warren grabbed a gun.
I saw 2 aircraft coming straight towards me, and I just opened fire. I knew what hit him, because I saw the burst down the starboard side of his fuselage, and as he raced overhead, he'd already released his bomb, which I hadn't seen. The aircraft struck the mast, bent it over a 90-degree angle, and then exploded and dropped behind us.
The bomb ripped into the ship. Like the first, it failed to explode. With 2 live bombs below decks, the bomb disposal team of John Phillips and Jim Prescott hurried aboard.
I was then taken to the second unexploded bomb, which had come in from the starboard side. It had been wedged by the crew to stop it rolling around.
The bomb was in an extremely dangerous condition. Phillips and Prescott decided to use a rocket wrench to spin off the pistol fuse and disarm it.
The bomb was armed, the pistol was armed. We clamped the rocket wrench onto the pistol and retired to a relatively safe distance, which isn't too far on board ship. The rocket wrench simply spun off. It had not withdrawn the pistol as it was designed to do.
They'd been down 2 or 3 times to try and remove the fuse and were unsuccessful. It was getting dark. The captain then decided to clear lower deck and get everybody out of the ship on the upper deck where we would be safe should anything go wrong.
Phillips and Prescott now decided to cut off the pistol fuse.
The option we decided to go for was to use another tool which cuts and separates the pistol from the bomb, explosively.
And we'd been on the flight deck for about half an hour or so when there was an almighty explosion.
The bomb had been armed with a delaying fuse.
And the next thing I knew, I was flying through the air. I was conscious the whole time. I was flown through the air, and I was going down this tunnel that everybody sees, with the light at the end and the silhouette. I'm sure it was the silhouette of my father. The gangway door had been blown off by the blast, and it bent much like a paperclip in a U shape, and it's that had hit Jim fair and square and had caught my arm. The firefighting crew had come down after hearing the explosion. There was a hand on my shoulder, and the voice said, "There's nothing you can do for Jim, follow me."
The explosion had caused a gash of perhaps 40 or 50 feet in the ship's side, and all I could see inside was this glowing red mass of metal.
We climbed out the hatch onto the flight deck, where they then carried out first aid on me. I was insisting that they went back and get Jim out, but I now know that that's not the way they do things. He was confirmed as dead at the place, and he was left there.
The fire on Antelope was now out of control.
It was decided that we would have to abandon ship. I was then lowered over the side onto the landing craft.
Then a small boat came alongside and picked me up. And no sooner than I got in, that he started pulling away from the ship. And I said, "You can't go, because we've still got the captain and several other members of the crew still on board the ship."
They kept counting the crew because they hadn't accounted for everybody, and they weren't going to leave the side of the ship until they had accounted for everybody, which is fair enough. But I was lying there thinking, let's move away from this, let's go away, you know.
And then, within 5 minutes of us being off Antelope, the major explosion. It killed her, and I was one of the longest serving members on board. I've been in there over 3 years, and it's horrifying to think that it's your home that's gone. It's like a member of the family, and then it just went very quiet after the explosion. Everybody was very quiet with their own thoughts, I think, at the enormity of what had just happened and exactly how lucky we had been.
Jim was standing next to me at the time of the explosion, and I was the boss. He was carrying out orders, and as a consequence, he died. And that is that's a hell of a burden to take. Yes, I feel guilty. I should have died as well. I was lucky I survived.
The next day, the Antelope was there. Her back had been broken. She was in a V shape, a defiant V shape. Quite a sorry sight.
Sergeant Major Phillips was taken to Rick Jolly's field hospital at Ajax Bay, an abandoned refrigeration plant.
I do recall lying on the operating table, looking up, and what I could see was sort of plastic corrugated sheeting which were covered in dust. And I didn't think that was the sort of thing that should be in an operating theatre. After the operation, I was woken up, and there was a head above me which whispered in my ear that we've had to take your arm off.
The grand total has just been passed this morning of 100 operations under general anaesthetic, major operations? Yes, and some surgery of the highest calibre under conditions that I can only describe as appalling.
Admiral Woodward now moved his carriers closer to land and committed more of his Sea Harriers. Argentine pilots like Gustavo Puma now faced the highly maneuverable Harrier armed with Sidewinder missiles. Puma, like many other pilots, was shot down.
The plane went up not more than 60 or 70 meters and turned over. Then I ejected. I suppose it was like the passage to paradise, because as soon as I came out of the cabin, as my head came out, the impact with the air made me faint. And that's how I fell to the ground. I don't know how long I was unconscious. It must have been 10 or 15 minutes. No more, because the plane was still in flames close by. I woke up and touched my face and noticed blood. And I realized I was in the Malvinas. I felt emotional, kissed the land and began to pray.
Gustavo Puma was rescued by an Argentine helicopter. He returned to his airbase in southern Argentina, a hero. In 4 days, Argentina had lost over 30 planes at San Carlos. Admiral Woodward's strategy to break the enemy's air force was working.
In my squadron, we lost 9 planes and 8 pilots. Only 1 ejected. In the afternoon, we held a mass for them at the base. But we had lots of work to get on with and still had to fly missions.
They were looking around the mess at breakfast time the following day and observing that half their people weren't there. Half your friends have disappeared. And I guess that this must have affected them psychologically, though that wasn't obvious. They were extremely bravely handled and very determined people. But the sheer loss rate of aircraft was something they couldn't sustain. As a major force, a war-winning force, they were effectively beaten by about the 25th, 26th of May.
The beachhead was established. Britain's soldiers, outnumbered 3 to 1, were ready to take on the 10,000-strong Argentine army dug in across the islands. Despite heavy losses to her air force, Argentina boasted a weapon they hoped would tilt the war in their favour, the Exocet. HMS Sheffield had already been sunk by this lethal radar-guided missile. This had happened when Argentine fighters earlier tried to sink British carriers. Now, a day after the San Carlos beachhead had been secured, 2 Super Étendard aircraft took off from air bases in southern Argentina to try again. The Duke of York was a helicopter pilot flying anti-submarine patrols from the carrier Invincible.
I was going out and conducting basically long-range reconnaissance to see what surface contacts there were around, because we knew that there were some. I flew 113 hours for the whole of that month. The average was 30 hours a month in peacetime.
The giant civilian cargo ship Atlantic Conveyor, as big as an aircraft carrier herself, had moved up to the task force to unload her cargo of troop-carrying helicopters. But the giant ship had another vital role that afternoon. She was part decoy and part defensive shield to help protect Admiral Woodward's carriers from missile attack. The Duke of York was in the air when the Exocets came in.
We were airborne at the time of Atlantic Conveyor doing an anti-submarine patrol. We were over the top at the time. I saw bits and pieces landing in the water, and then I saw her just very slowly stop and turn across the wind.
The Exocets mistook the huge bulk of the freighter for one of the carriers.
Dusk at the time that this happened, and in the darkness, pulling people out of the water when they finally abandoned ship. And I think we pulled three, maybe 4 out of the water. The captain of Atlantic Conveyor was never picked up.
12 crewmen died. All but one of the precious helicopters were lost. Without knowing it, Argentina had inflicted a heavy blow to Brigadier Julian Thompson's land campaign. Thompson needed the helicopters to carry his men the 65 miles to Stanley to attack the main Argentine garrison there.
I was sitting in my command post with some of my staff putting finishing touches to the plan to move my whole brigade forward using these helicopters, when a guy came in and stuck his head round the corner and said, "Atlantic Conveyor has been sunk, taking all the helicopters to the bottom." It was a black point because my means to move my whole brigade forward using these helicopters had been destroyed, and so somebody then remarked, well, bloody well have to walk, and that's what they had to do.
After losing so many ships at San Carlos, the War Cabinet in London were pressing for a quick victory on land. 2 Para were ordered to mount a diversionary raid on the settlement of Goose Green, 15 miles from the beachhead at San Carlos. There, 1,500 Argentine troops were thought to be holding 100 islanders prisoner. 2 Para's commanding officer, Colonel Herbert Jones, known as H, set off on foot with only 400 men. Despite a lack of ammunition and inadequate artillery support, a decision was made in London to capture Goose Green. Chris Keeble was his second in command.
So H turned raid into capture, but the logistics stayed the same. The resources for the task stayed the same. So there was always a mismatch between capturing Goose Green and the resources available.
2 Para walked to Goose Green through the night from San Carlos. Goose Green was at the end of a long, thin strip of land.
This was a narrow corridor. We were fighting down a very narrow corridor. Very open terrain, no cover, which makes it very difficult to fight a battle. It's midwinter, it's snowing, there's a 30-40 knot wind.
The Argentines' front line of trenches was 2 miles from Goose Green. After hiding during the day, the Paras attacked the following night. Cameras weren't there to record the bloody hand-to-hand combat.
This was gutter fighting. Trench by trench, fighting up across the open terrain to get to the trench. Closing with the enemy, grenade, burst of machine gun fire, bayonet if necessary, moving on, consolidating, moving on, keeping the momentum going.
At dawn, after 4 hours of fighting, they encountered the main Argentine defensive positions behind a line of gorse across Darwin Hill.
Our attack started to falter at that point, really, as we encountered the resistance of that defensive line.
David Abels was a young corporal.
There was chaos. It was chaos everywhere. Fighting up the gully itself.
Take move! My left!
A couple of the section commanders from 2 platoon had been either killed or injured. But we could see something like 17 or 18 trenches at the top of the hill. So what we were trying to do was go up to the top of the hill and look for the best place to attack these trenches from. And at the top was the sniper. But every time we went up, we lost people with headshots, and that's why we know it was the sniper. And we were up and down this hill for about 7 or 8 times, and we always lost or got somebody injured in the process.
A Company was spearheading the attack, but it was down to 2 platoons, 70 men fighting 200 entrenched Argentinians. The Paras hadn't slept for 2 grueling days and casualties were mounting. To break the deadlock, Colonel H. Jones put his own life on the line. In an unusual move for a commanding officer, H went forward into the Gorse Gully, the heart of the battle.
H had obviously and rightly gone to the place in his battalion where the greatest threat lay. I think because A Company were down to 2 platoons, it had severely limited their mobility. They'd very little. Any unit that's only got 2 subunits has lost its manoeuvrability, really.
Colonel Jones led by example. With utmost gallantry, he led an attack on enemy trenches on Darwin Hill.
The last thing I heard was Colonel Jones shouting, "Come on, A Company, get your skates off," and then disappeared. He disappeared out the corner of my eye, and I said to my friend Jerry Toole, I said, if he goes around there, he's ready, he'll get killed.
Colonel Jones was shot from this trench and mortally wounded.
We tried to give him first aid initially. He was still alive, but because I'd seen the way my friend died and I could see it in his eyes, I thought that the way his eyes looked at me, I slapped him across the face a few times. I thought, no, he's going to go.
We had a prearranged code word, and the phrase was Sunray, which was the radio language for a commanding officer. Sunray is down was passed to me, and I heard that back up at our command and control headquarters. And so I said to say again, and the operator transmitted this phrase to me again. And I then suddenly realized the seriousness of what had happened and imagined that H had been injured in some way. And I now had to take command.
Despite H's courage, the situation remained desperate. The Paras had lost the initiative. Keeble had to find a way to break the enemy's will. (11 a.m., May the 28th. After 12 hours of fighting, 2 Paras' battle to liberate Goose Green had ground to a halt. Colonel H. Jones, their commanding officer, was dead, and Chris Keeble, his number 2, had to pick up the gauntlet.
Warfare, for me, is a contest of wills in which you use violence to persuade the enemy to change his mind, to break his will.
With stealth, some of Keeble's exhausted men got to within point-blank range of the Argentine trenches and fired anti-tank rockets.
The Sergeant Major fired a 66 at what we thought was a command trench, but just missed it. I fired one, and it hit the command trench. And then all of a sudden, the Argentinians on the top of the hill surrendered.
Darwin Hill had fallen. News cameras recorded the high casualties on both sides. The total strength of the Paras was down to just over 300 men.
All I could see was a row of about 30 casualties, both English and Argentinian. Everything from head wounds, stomach wounds, shot in the legs, shot in the arms. And it didn't matter who they were actually put in an order of the priority of the seriousness of their injury. So you'd have an Argentinian, para-reg Argentinian.
Corporal Abels won the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his actions at Darwin Hill, but the battle wasn't won. A mile away over the brow of Darwin Hill lay Goose Green, and 1,300 Argentine troops. Then at 3:30, with his men exhausted and virtually out of ammunition, Chris Keeble finally managed to call in air support.
We had been appealing to the brigade to bring in an airstrike. If we could bring in a cluster bomb attack on the outskirts of Goose Green, this would be a real clincher. And by sunset, 3 Harriers came in and dropped the CBUs, cluster bombs, around the settlement. And it was like somebody switching the light out. The whole battlefield just went quiet as this awesome amount of ordnance landed in the space of half a second around the settlement. We had not just been fighting, we'd been awake for something like 60 hours, on and off. And by that night, when I was up in the gully behind Darwin Hill, I was exhausted and was carrying the burden of command, which is very lonely. And something like 1 in 6 of us was injured or killed. I went down this gully to meet my company commanders, or 2 of them, and they looked at me as if in a kind of final appeal. So what are we going to do now, boss? And I had no idea. So I knelt down in the gorse line and I said this prayer. My Father, I abandon myself to you. Do with me as you will. Whatever your will is for you, I accept it. And it was quite extraordinary. I suddenly felt absolutely clear what I needed to do. And I walked back up to the company commanders and I said, I know exactly what we're going to do here. I'm going to engage with the enemy in some kind of negotiation. And I'm going to contact the enemy and invite them to have us surrender.
Many lives had been lost. Keeble's stratagem was to stop more. Believing the Argentines' will was broken and wishing to spare their lives and the settlers imprisoned by them, he sent a message to their commander. The Red Berets are the best soldiers in the world. Surrender or face the consequences.
I said, if you don't surrender, we'll dump this ordnance on you and continue the battle, and we will fight to capture Goose Green.
The gamble on Chris's part was that we were relying on the Argentines not knowing exactly how few we were. And we were very, very few. We were few when we started, and by the time we'd reached this stage of the battle, we were well down in our numbers. I think had they known how few we were, they may well have decided to continue fighting.
Their will had gone, and they wanted to concede. And they wanted to concede with dignity. So we arranged for them to surrender as soldiers, not as defeated soldiers. So they formed up in a hollow square outside Goose Green. The Argentine commander saluted me and handed me his pistol, and I invited his soldiers to lay down their weapons. It was something like 1,500, I think, who formed up and formed a hollow square and laid down their weapons.
And the dead were subsequently evacuated back to Ajax Bay, where they were buried in a trench grave with all the dead from Goose Green of our side. I took the service.
Lieutenant Colonel Jones, Captain Dent, Lieutenant Barry, Corporal Hardman.
War is just one dreadful sight after another. It is difficult to describe what war's like to a person who's never been in it. In fact, I'd say it's impossible.
Lance Corporal Smith, Lance Corporal Bingley, Private Holman Smith, Private Fletcher, Private Illingsworth, Private Meakin, Private Dixon, Lieutenant Nunn, Private...
killing is something that we don't normally do. A battlefield is a highly immoral environment. I'd like to think of myself as a Christian warrior, and the way I translate that into practical action is that as an officer, I am responsible for trying to make violence, killing, justified, legitimate. I have to have some rationale that sustains the legitimacy of what I'm doing.
Ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
We'd 17 killed at Goose Green, of whom 3/4 were officers or NCOs. It tells me that the parachute regiment's got some very good leaders.
Goose Green signalled to the Argentines the determination of the British to succeed.